And for anyone already listening, I'm going to include this in the chat box, but to make sure to put all the questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the session.
Yeah, let her finish her talk, and then you can add the Q&A along the way, and we can pick them up later, or you can ask at the end. I'm Tom Christensen. I direct the China in the World program here at Columbia University. And I wanted to say that this is part of our speaker series. The semester is winding down, so I wanted to take an opportunity to thank Daniel Sahinsky for his excellent work during the pandemic, keeping this series going. We've had record numbers of attendees because of the technology, and it's been a very successful year despite a lot of challenges, and Daniel deserves most of the credit for that. Today we have a very special speaker. It's always special when the program invites back one of its own, and that label, one of our own, doesn't apply to anyone better than it applies to Maria Adele Carrai, who is a former fellow in our program. She's an expert on Chinese sovereignty and on China's BRI project and governance issues related to it that you'll hear about today. She's not a political scientist by training, and that's one of the special things she's brought to our program and our community. She has a PhD in law from Hong Kong University, and she has various degrees in area studies in Italy, from Bologna, Venice, and Rome. And she has a different perspective on some of these issues that we are all interested in than someone who always trained in political science. And she's been a very active member of the Columbia China in the World community. She's been a very active alum of the program in our yearly workshops and conferences. And she's also a fellow at the Italian Institute at Columbia, which is just below my office on Amsterdam Avenue. And she once even hosted us at one of our conferences at that beautiful facility. We would never have access to it without Adela. So I'm really thrilled to have her here and welcome her back. So I'll turn it over to you, Adela, and then please, if you can hold your questions or put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll address them after she finishes her talk. Welcome back, Adela.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction and for inviting me back, and for Daniel for arranging all this and coordinating. And I have very fond memories about my time as a fellow at the, was still in Princeton, was the last year it was in Princeton. And I cherish very much the mentoring, all the mentoring that I receive, and also the long time relationship that I developed with colleagues, and it's a great community. So I'm very glad to be part of it. And today I'm going to talk about my last research project that was based on field work that I've done in the summer 2019 in Kenya and Ethiopia. I've been interested in China present and China BRI. I started working on the BRI when I was a fellow at the program, 2017. And I started looking at investment, Chinese investment in Eastern Africa in railroad. And today I will talk about adaptive governance along Chinese finance BRI railroad mega project in East Africa. It's a very long title. And so the reason why I started this research is because very often we hear all this press about China, especially in the developing world and in Africa. And so China is now trying to promote authoritarianism. So it's exporting its model of government, its surveillance system, its authoritarian rules, especially in poor countries that see China as an example. It also promoting bad governance, not respecting the good governance standards that are instead promoted by Western countries. For instance, it's not respecting the rule of law, transparency, environmental standards, social standards, etc., etc. And also there is the idea that China is actively promoting neocolonialism. It's becoming a neocolonial power that, similarly to European powers in the past, is trapping this country into that trap, trying to extract as much as it can from this country's resources. And I think here, this idea is very well represented by this figure here, that we see the poor nations lured by Chinese money entering the shark mouth and be swallowed probably. However, I think that there are problems in the depiction in this image and the way China has been portrayed, all this narrative of debt trap, China promoting bad governance. And there is a problem both in the way we look at China, but also in the way we look at these poor nations, right? That they have no agency and they are basically the victim of this big China. And what I tried to do in my article is really to partly disaggregate, to look more concretely at who are the actors that are operating abroad and how much control does the China central state have over China Exim Bank representative or the Chinese company that actually built BRI projects all over the world. And by the end of my presentation, I hope that the picture will be more nuanced than this figure shows. But let's go into my presentations. And so we saw an increased engagement of China with the world, and like hence the name of the program, China and the World. And this started with China going out in 1999. And in 2013, it launched its Belt and Road Initiative. And here we have on the right a map. And since 2013, there's already 3,100 projects that have been labeled BRI. And this BRI really includes all sorts of projects. Now it includes mass diplomacy, vaccine, it goes through the space, the Arctic, digital. So it's a bit of everything. And we still are not clear exactly of what projects are really part of this BRI. And we know that it's over $1 trillion investment that is planned, or even more, depending on what project is considered being part of the BRI. And its aim is to address the infrastructure gap of Asia, but really of so many different things. And this Chinese engagement, of course, created a lot of anxiety about global rise, its increased activities in international financing, and also how this increased investment might translate into new development paradigm for the world, and how this might replace Western model. And I think this is a bit outplaced, like this anxiety. Of course, China is rising, and so it's natural that we have to replace ourselves. And the BRI certainly had some issues, and so a recent study has showed that of 1,814 BRI projects, 270 had issues on debt, labor, corruption, and environmental standards. So this is not to say that the project have no issues, on the contrary, but what are the reasons for having these issues? And most importantly, is it intentional? Is China really trying very hard to promote corruption, or having this project having issues with labor or environmental standards? And so I looked at China in Africa as one case studies. And I just briefly say like the history to just give a context of China increased engagement in Africa. And it all started, I mean, with the PRC, with the Bandung Conference in 1951, where they set forth like this principle of South-South cooperation and the shared victimhood, if you want, of Western imperialism. And they set forth also the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that we see very much emphasized still today, and sovereignty, first of all. And we saw, as I will discuss in a second, Chinese investments in the 60s as part of its proletarian internationalism and spreading ideology. And now instead, from the 2000s, the Chinese engagement started to be also translated more in economic terms. And so we saw in 2000 and in the year 2000, the establishment of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and in 2006, the first China-Africa Development Fund. that is really aimed at devoting money to the development of Africa. And we saw an increasing engagement. So in 2009, China became Africa's largest trading partner, and it is also the largest bilateral lender to many African countries. And African countries were happy to sign into the BRI because according to the Africa Development Bank, Africa has an infrastructural gap that requires an investment between 130 and 170 billion per year. And 44 African countries have already joined the BRI. And here we see an old plaque, the road to national prosperity is made of steel. And it's something that also Xi Jinping shared, and he wants to give tangible benefits to the African people. And here is, I think it's also very interesting, this map to see what we're talking about. And we can see how Europe, India, America, Asia, East Asia, they're full of infrastructure, of railroad. And Africa is basically the Central Africa as nothing. And it's really interesting to see because the lack of cross-border infrastructure is a big problem. And the World Bank has estimated that it costs more to ship a car from Japan to Nigeria than from Nigeria to Kenya. So it's a huge cost because there's no infrastructure that connects the east and the west coast of Africa. And China, of course, comes in and fill the gap. And we already have precursors, if you want, of Chinese engagement, but as I said before, it was more ideological. We have the Tazara Railroad in Zambia that linked a landlocked country to the sea, and it was completed in 1975, and it ran for 1,860 kilometers. And that was really a sign of proletarian internationalism. But now China comes in with the BRI, and we can see here on the right some of the investments in infrastructure and railroad by China, Africa, and India in Africa. And let's see here. And the question is China trying to appending development guidance and good governance with this infrastructure project? And a way to look at it is by focusing on corporate social responsibility. That is business generating wealth for shareholders through ethical policies and sustainable management practices such as economic viability, positive social impact, preserving the environment, and overall sustainable development. And I focused on Chinese economic actors in financing and building two railroad mega projects in Africa. One is the Kenya Starter Gauge Railroad, and the other one is Ethiopia-Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railroad. And I analyzed primary sources like Chinese government corporate social responsibility guidelines and host country regulatory frameworks and guidelines. And I also did some field work in Kenya and Ethiopia 2 years ago. Through the 2 case studies, I seek to answer one overarching question. Does China development financing with a recently increased global scope aim to replace the Western model of financing based on good governance, high standards, rule of law, or not? And as I will discuss later, my research shows instead that, at least for these 2 case studies, China does not seem to be forcing any specific type of governance upon its BRI host countries. But let's look at the 2 railroad. So these 2 railroad actually, so one is this one, Ethiopia, that goes from the capital to Djibouti, and this one instead is Kenya. So it didn't come out well. I'm sorry, it got cut away. And on the top left, we see the East Africa Railroad Master Plan. And so China really responded to a plan that was already in place, as it is often the case, because we often think that China comes in and builds this white elephant project, but very often this railroad and ports, etc., they are commissioned, and they're the host country that come and go and beg China to build certain projects. This was, for instance, also the case of Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port with Pakistan. And so in these two cases, it was also the host country that came in and asked for China financing and building this this project. And so let's go here. Sorry, the next. And so here we can see a bit of the difference. Both projects connect a port and the capital. And they're both funded by China Exim Bank, and they're both built by Chinese construction company. And the Kenya Starter Gate Railroad was started to be built later in 2014 and became operational in 2017, earlier than the Ethiopia-Djibouti Railroad that was inaugurated in 2016 and became operational in 2018. But the construction started in 2011. And also when I was there, so while in Kenya you can easily access tickets, in Ethiopia, the Ethiopia-Djibouti Railroad, it was blocked when I was there, so I wasn't able to travel with that. So there were operational difficulties still then. And so the question is like, why there was, as we'll see in 1 second, like different corporate social responsibility practices between the two projects. And the answer that I tried to give is that Chinese economic actors promoted adaptive governance. And we will see that the Chinese central state is really trying hard to improve its regulation on its economic actors abroad, on corporate social responsibility, but it lacks ultimately sufficient control over these economic actors. And the PRC government has created, as we will see in a second, an increasingly detailed and comprehensive regulation and encouraged the release of sustainability report. But the Chinese economic actors are either not aware of some of these guidelines or they don't view them as particularly important. And for instance, the Chinese representative that I interviewed from Exim Bank and CRVC, they weren't really much aware of all these regulations. And this results in an adaptation in host country circumstances and conditions. Okay, so let's briefly look at China CSR regulation. So China started to focus on corporate social responsibility from the year 2000 in correspondence of its going out policy, and even more since the launch of its BRI. And China presently lacks an overarching law that governs overseas commercial and foreign assistance activity, and it has started to emphasize the importance of higher standards, nevertheless. And in 2006, corporate social responsibility was included in Chinese corporate law. And from 2008, there was an increasing number of guidelines on CSR that were produced. And from 2001 to 2018, also the Chinese economic actors and enterprises started to refer and produce corporate social responsibility report. And there was an increase of 8.5% a year. However, as I already mentioned, one of the main weaknesses is that there is a lack of enforcement of this regulation, so they're mostly voluntary. And the language very often is vague and it's difficult to translate into practice and to measurable objectives. And also state-owned enterprises, managers and employers are unaware of these directives. And as it was the case when I interview these officials in Ethiopia and Kenya. And so here we just have a sample of some of the regulations, just for your reference. And this is just like a few samples from hundreds of these regulations that really try to push more control and more corporate social responsibility of Chinese actors abroad. And also there's increasing number of guidance that emphasize the greening of the Belt and Road Initiative and greening financing as well. And so in order to analyze this adaptive governance, I will look at this Kenya and Ethiopia, and I will start by examining the regulatory framework of these two countries very briefly. I've done that better in the article that just came out in World Development. And I also will look at the China host country civil society. Okay, so here the regulations and civil society in Kenya, we can see that it has a very well developed legal system and regulatory framework with respect to environmental laws. And according to Kenya Constitution, citizens have the right to petition a court for redress if they feel their environment rights have been infringed upon. And the environmental, there is a lot of attention on environmental issues, also because Kenya it attracts a lot of tourism, so that's also important for the country. And there's also detailed labor law and active unions in Kenya that was very much felt by Chinese economic actors when I interviewed them there. And there's also been an improvement in the practice of collective labor rights in the past years. And also a big difference between Kenya and Ethiopia is the fact that Kenya has a very lively civil society and free media. And we see how this had influence in the way Chinese constructor reacted and responses to the demands of the media in terms of producing more promptly corporate social responsibility reports. And here we see Chinese corporate social responsibility on Kenya's SGR, Standard Gauge Railroad. And so with the Kenya Vibrant Civil Society, and media, Chinese firm created a public relation office, gave interviews, and used social media platforms that were forbidden in mainland China, like Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, and published quite quickly, quite promptly, a CSR report online. And they also hired a lot of local law firms. And they also tried to avoid labor dispute, and they hired 60% of local non-skilled workers, and they reserve also senior railroad talent for Kenyans. So they really made effort to hire local people and transfer technology locally. Also, they also adapted there was a lot of criticism for the railroad going through the Nairobi National Park, and so they did further studies. They analyzed 10 different routes, and they created a super elevated route so that it will not harm, in theory, the animals. And as I said before, like CSR a report was published in 2016, just 2 years after the start of the construction. That was quite quick. And let's look now quickly at the regulations and civil society in Ethiopia. Also here we have a quite well-developed environmental legislation and also sustainable development law, to the point that there is a right that is enshrined in the constitution about the right to improve living standard and sustainable development for Ethiopian people. And also in terms of environment, there is a well-developed regulations and law that requires further authorization from the relevant agency and the environmental impact assessments. And also in terms of collective labor rights, there is an imposition of rates of localizations that we can see also in the case of this railroad, how Ethiopia was basically forced China to hire a certain number of workers. However, the main difference between Kenya and Ethiopia is that Ethiopia has a much less robust civil society. And so there was the access to the main platform was often blocked. Also, when I was there, I couldn't use, for instance, WhatsApp. And they use similar technology to China. And this is not surprising because Ethiopia, leading state-owned internet provider, just signed a deal with China for 800 million to strengthen Ethiopia's censorship capacities. And so if we look at corporate social responsibility, the practice of Chinese corporate social responsibility on Ethiopia-Djibouti railroad, we can see that also as a result of a more weak civil society, Chinese state-owned enterprises' public relation efforts to promote a socially and environmentally responsible image were much more lower and less sophisticated than in Kenya. And Chinese SOEs were much less active on social media, also because some of these platforms were blocked. And also didn't have to respond to strong critiques from civil society as in Kenya. And it's only in 2019 that the company that built the railroad announced on Facebook that it released its first corporate social responsibility report. And given Ethiopia's increased emphasis on labor rights, one of the company that built the railroad prioritized local hiring for construction. And we can see how it hired over 20,000 locals in Ethiopia and 5,000 in Djibouti, which comprise the majority of the construction workers. And this is different from what we hear over and over in media, that China just brings its own Chinese workers and doesn't hire any of the local. This is definitely not the case in Ethiopia, but not even in Kenya. One of the issues, and I'm open to talk more, it's technology transfer that sometimes is not that high. And for the ADR, there wasn't any major environmental problem. But here again, one of the differences is that Ethiopia doesn't live off tourism, and so maybe the standards were a bit lower than in Kenya. Okay, overall, we can look at the economic impact of these railroads, and we can see how in both cases China Exim Bank opposed transparency of the contract. And in the case of Kenya, Kenya went against its procurement rules because according to the procurement rules, Kenya should make the contract public, but it didn't under pressure of Exim Bank. But this is also quite the norm. I mean, for this kind of contract that are not available, there's secrecy, a lot of secrecies around these deals. We can also see in the case of Kenya a sort of learning process of China Exim Bank, because it was planned an extension of the railroad, but it was stopped because now they want to see better support of how Kenya is going to repay the loan. And so far it has not been disbursed, the money for the next section of the railroad. And there are both positive and negative externalities. And like positive externalities in the case of Kenya is that there is a possibility of contribution to 1.5% of Kenya GDP growth. Although this is always difficult to measure, like you never know really how an infrastructure project can impact the economy. It's very hard, you'll see the results in years. It's not that straightforward. But in terms of Addis-Djibouti Railroad, we can see that the railroad connected a landlocked country to the sea, and there is huge potential for trade and developing industrial parks that are already flourishing, if you want. And for instance, even H&M just started its production in Ethiopia. And in both cases, however, there's issues with debt. And that led to a renegotiation in both cases of the debt. But we're very far from being in a debt trap in both cases. And so in terms of social impact, we can see that in Kenya, there was the Chinese SOE established a three-level training system, social and environmental criteria for subcontractor, but these were not open, so there's still a bit of lack of transparency. And for Addis-Djibouti, we can see the yearly report, and there is also this localization policy and tech and capacities transfer, although it was not necessarily the most successful. And in terms of positive and negative externalities, we can see how the Chinese constructor in the Kenya Standard Gauge Railroad collaborated with 934 local suppliers, created 50,000 jobs, trained 5,000 people, and supported 100 Kenyan students to go and study in China. Instead, for Ethiopia-Djibouti Railroad, we see that the Chinese constructor hired over 20,000 local workers in Ethiopia and 5,000 in Djibouti. That, as I said before, made the majority of the construction workers, contrary to what is generally believed about China. And it also trained local personnel through a program that aimed to send employees from the Ethiopia Railroad Company to technical universities in Beijing, Tianjin, and Chengdu. However, in both cases, there was a strong complaint for labor-related lawsuits for low payment and poor treatment. And this sometimes is a result of different culture that clash against each other. You know, you have Chinese that comes in and they're used to work 9 and 6 in a country where it said this is not necessarily the practice. So even from food, sometimes I remember, like, you know, the local worker were complaining that they were just eating rice or something. So there is a lot of also cultural differences that generates this tension and lawsuits. And there was also in both cases a strong complaint about labor, about land disputes and compensation. But this, in both cases, was not the fault or the responsibility of China. This was a responsibility to compensate the owners of the land. Is really the responsibility of the host country government. But of course, like China was indirectly considered the culprit. And in terms of environment, Exim Bank conducted pre and ex-ante environmental social impact and green financing. It adopted social and environmental criterion for subcontractor, as I said before, but they were not open. And they really tried to promote green financing as much as they can. And also here we have both positive and negative externalities. In the case of Kenya Standard Gauge Railroad, the Chinese constructor did welfare activities and promote environmental protection, charity and relief activities. They also, as I said before, analyzed 10 alternative routes to the national park to make a more animal-friendly design for the Kenya National Park. However, this is often not enough for the NGOs, environmental NGOs, and so they still complain that a railroad could not pass in a national park. So the environmental impact is still kind of unclear. In terms of Ethiopia-Djibouti Railroad, the constructors of the railroad both attempted to preserve the regional landscape and spent 4 million on the construction of wildlife crossing to ensure animal safety, and we can see it in the image below. And there's not really much negative externality that were that Ethiopia complained about. And overall, so I think that while in these two cases, while Chinese state-owned enterprises have prioritized corporate social responsibility, these two case studies have shown that the implementation largely depends on the local condition, and hence I think there is a sort of adaptive governance. There isn't really a top-down imposition of certain rules, although the government would like its economic actors abroad to be better when they invest and they build BRI projects abroad. And the key to corporate social responsibility success or failure seems to rest in the host country regulation, institutional frameworks, and willingness also to allow its civil society to voice its opinion about infrastructure projects. And the adaptability can also be seen and understood as just another embodiment of China's non-intervention, sovereignty first foreign policy. And negative externalities overall result from Chinese state-owned enterprises' adaptation to the regulatory gap of host countries and insufficient Chinese state enforcement of corporate social responsibility policies. So I think also future research really should look at how these Chinese economic actors operates abroad, and how there is so much variation in different projects. And I want to conclude just with this sentence from Sir Charles Eliot of 1903. I took this picture at the museum of the Railroad Museum in Nairobi. And it is not an uncommon thing for a line to open up a country, but this line literally created a country. And I'm just thinking about what railroad can create. And of course, like there's a lot of kind of negative externalities, but also what are the positive externalities, and how will this infrastructure, this BRI infrastructure project will create new countries or new realities. And so here I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Adele. It was a terrific talk, and it shows the amount of knowledge you gained when you took your field research back when we could still do field research 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And I remember when you went to Ethiopia and you answered a bunch of questions that I was interested in a very useful fashion. I remember back then asking you whether you thought China had some preference over the domestic governance model of the host countries. Ethiopia was going through, it wasn't so much a democratic reform, but there was some political liberalization going on a few years back. And the reputation for China was that it supports authoritarianism through its investments. And I remember asking you whether you thought China was interfering in the domestic political process or just carrying out its contract. So maybe you provide the answer to me. I know the answer you gave me then, but maybe you could provide that same answer for the audience, because I thought it was a useful response.
Yeah, so I think in Ethiopia was definitely a process of liberalization, but it's far from being a democratization process. The two, I think, are not really going hand in hand. And I can just say that when I was there, I couldn't use my WhatsApp. And I don't think Ethiopia was able to develop this technology of like censorship. So I think that probably was an influence, if you want. But again, I don't know how much this all happened closed door, but I don't think it was China behind the door saying, oh, you should, promoting surveillance system or authoritarianism. Was more a request from the government, from Ethiopia government, having this strong ties with China and all these investments coming from China.
So I wanted to ask another question. I know there's a few in the Q&A, but I want to get my questions out first. So I just taught about the BRI in my Chinese foreign relations class in the last couple of weeks. And one of the issues that I raised, and I get this in part from one of our previous speakers, Erica Downs, who studies the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is probably the biggest single project in the BRI. It seems to me that a lot of the infrastructure investment that China's made in Latin America and Africa, and also the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, seems like a lot of it started before the Belt and Road was announced. So I just get your opinion. I ask people this all the time, and there's no definitive answer, but what's your sense of how much of this would be going on even if there was not a giant program called Belt and Road and it wasn't worked into the Constitution? And then as a subset of that question, what I always ask is, if you think the Belt and Road Initiative that Xi Jinping announced has really expanded what would naturally happen, do you think it's producing politically driven, sort of economically less viable projects because people want to impress the great leader? Or do you think that it's pretty much on course where it would be without the announcement of this political program?
Yeah, so I think it's a bit both. And there were definitely projects that were going on before the BRI, and I think also the Pakistan case, like they requested like funding before the BRI was launched, and probably even in Sri Lanka, if I'm not wrong. So I think some of this would have happened regardless. But I think the BRI, like putting this label there, probably create new imaginaries, right, about things, and now everything is becoming part of the BRI. And there are also new funds that have been created. These are not large funds like the BRI, the Silk Road Fund. It's not huge, like it's not, or even the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is not really just for the BRI. And if you look at all the projects, it's really minimal what it gave in terms of loans to projects related to the BRI. But I think putting this this kind of big label on that, it created, or like it incorporated all these projects, and like, you know, and some were probably rethought in some ways, but many were already existing and would have been there even if it was no BRI label. One thing though that I think is positive that the BRI caused is all this alarmism from other countries. And I think this is positive because now Chinese projects are so scrutinized. And so it's even more careful, if you want, in what it's happening outside, right? It's what its economic actors are actually doing abroad. So that was in a way kind of positive, because it probably will improve, it will force the China learning curve, like a speed kind of improvement, if you want, because of all the scrutiny that it's there.
Thank you. So we should turn to the Q&A section. Do you want to handle that, Daniel?
Yes, absolutely. Hold on one second. All right, so the first question from today comes from one of this year's fellows, actually, Austin Strange, who asks, given that these are mega projects, are there cases where SEO prioritization of CSR will be highest? Or should we expect similar approaches across the board as SEOs continue to go out, including on projects not as massive or infamous?
Yeah, thank you, Austin. I'm happy you're here. Sad that I cannot see you, but I think that like this big project and state-owned enterprises certainly will promote more, because they're more on the front line. And so I think there will be more of a enforcement. There's not really enforcement mechanism yet for these guidelines, but I think they will be more prone to listen and to follow on what the Chinese central government say in terms of governance. But I was so surprised because they weren't, when I interviewed them, like they weren't really that. There was not really awareness, like of the, you know, about like the rule like that was issued, and there wasn't really much awareness of these regulations. And so, but probably, yeah, if it starts like it should be probably from the largest and more visible state-owned enterprises, and big projects as well.
Next question comes from another one of our past fellows, Minya from Boston. She asks, could you comment from an international public and private laws perspective how Beijing can use international laws to manage BRI risks, specifically the WTO framework and China's third-party cooperation mechanism?
Okay, so I'm reading it also. So I'm not actually, China, it's adopting that, and even the fact that is using corporate social responsibility is quite, it shows that it's following what's happening like internationally. Like those are like the sort of the best standards. It's really trying to be in line with the standards. And again, the problem would be enforcement of this of international law. Even if it follow the FWO framework and China's third-party cooperation mechanisms, there's still an issue of implementation and enforcement of all these rules. So on paper, if you look at all the regulations that are there, and I discuss them also in my article, and there are studies of that, there are really hundreds. And I don't think that China is lacking laws or regulations. I don't think that the regulations that you have are less than the FWO framework, but the problem is really the implementation.
Next question, this is kind of a two-part question from Larry Cook. You said you were looking at the questions, so it might be
Yes,
this one as well, but it says, from your observations in East Africa, do you think it is a fair criticism to label Chinese lending practices as debt traps? I know you touched on this a little bit in your lecture. Can you speak to what is happening in other parts of Africa? And the second part of his question is, should the West support and collaborate with China's efforts to develop the BRI? Or are we missing an opportunity to collaborate and build new markets?
Okay, thank you so much. And so I think that it's misplaced, the debt trap diplomacy kind of narrative in the two project that I look. And actually, Mombasa has been taken as an example of debt trap, because part of the contract leaked. And then, according to media report, they said that, this is a debt for equity swap, and so China will take over Mombasa port. But then, if you look at the parts of the contract that have leaked, there's nowhere that it says that like Mombasa will be taken over. So I don't even know how news are created. And these are very complex agreements. You need several people, several experts to understand the thousands of pages of this contracts. And if you read in media, there's just more confusion. There isn't really yet. Now, Deborah Brautigam, I think, recently published something that talks about this debt trap myth, and I think that is very authoritative source. But other than that, I think there's so much confusion, and a lot of report, even from authoritative sources, just create more noise than actually give us a clear understanding of what's happening. So in the two cases, there's no debt, there's no evidence for debt trap, neither in Ethiopia or in Kenya. That said, I think they're taking more and more loans from China, so that might become a problem in the future. The fact that these countries become too dependent on one single country, and what it means in terms of political leverage for the future. But there isn't really a debt trap, and more so, it's not really that China is intentionally, in none of this project, China intentionally tried to put these countries on their knees. It was unplanned, and very often is a project that started really from the host country, like crazy project that didn't really make much of economic sense. That China, okay, let's give money, like let's try to be friend, let's create more soft power. That didn't work out really. And again, I think something that I often say is that China is also the beginning of its going out kind of process. I mean, it's still 20 years when it started, like the going out policy, BRI 2013. So I think it's still going into these other countries, and it's also really learning itself quite quickly, and it's improving also its practice, for instance, of corporate social responsibility, avoiding white elephant. But it's a big risk. It's a big project, BRI. So there will continue to be failures and white elephants. So let me see the other question.
Yeah, Adele, before you move on to another one, I wanted to chime in on that one. One of the things Deborah Brautigam shows in the Sri Lanka case is that China tried to restructure the loans on several occasions before it actually defaulted, before the Sri Lankans defaulted. And that would suggest that they didn't want that outcome. They wouldn't restructure the loans if they wanted them to fail. They were trying to save them in some sense. And in your case, I noticed that you said in Kenya that when the Kenyans were having difficulty repaying for the projects that had already been completed, that China slowed down the project and did not do the extension until they realized Kenya could pay back. That would be evidence suggesting that China wasn't celebrating Kenya's inability to return the loans, that they actually want the money back.
Exactly.
And it runs against the whole debt trap notion. And I talked to a Chinese banker. I went to a conference in Brussels, and he's a Chinese banker involved in Belt and Road. And he asked me to explain what debt trap diplomacy was. He said, I keep hearing about it. It was pretty new back then, the term, right? He said, I keep hearing about it. Can you tell me what it is and how, as a banker, I'm supposed to continue to give bad loans and be able to keep doing that forever? Like, I don't understand as a banker why I would want to give a bunch of bad loans. Can you explain it to me? And I basically told him I couldn't.
Yeah, and also I think also talking to these bankers that I met, I mean, they're interested in making profit. And, you know, sometimes we forget how there are different kind of interests, priorities, even with the central government, right? So the central government, and it's so interesting to see how they operate, they think they differently. And this is something to keep in mind, but they need to profit. They want the project to succeed and make it profitable.
And I think that's something that maybe you can emphasize in your talks, because in this audience, you're fine because it's China in the world. And, you know, we realize what China's been doing in the BRI at the broadest sense. But I think it's important to point out that this is not foreign assistance.
No,
These are loans, and they're expected to be paid back for profit, which is a little bit different than some other projects that are the major donors and others that are involved in the world in infrastructure development. Anyway, go back over to you and back to Daniel for the questions.
So let me see, like the second question. Thank you, Larry. So should the West support collaborate with China effort to develop the BRI? I'm missing. I think that the West should definitely collaborate, and there are opportunities. Like we thought about the BRI as only China executed project, but there are many instances in which some of the projects are made in collaboration with even major, like with the World Bank, or they hire a subcontractor like Caterpillar, for instance, right? When they build roads or other things. So it's not just like China only projects. And I think also as a way to make the BRI, if you want, better, I think it's a good way rather than building something kind of in opposition to it, see whether there are like opportunities to collaborate and collaborate. And then, yeah, especially for America, I think this will be, I mean, America will never join the BRI, I think, but they're really operating in different realms. So even like America, it's private sector. US cannot even compete in infrastructure with China in Africa. There's no way. So it's good if China build roads, right? We can use it for something else. We can develop software. We can provide services. So there can definitely be complementarities here, and that could be exploited. Okay.
Sure. The next question, I reached out to them to inquire what this was about. It was in regard to, earlier you mentioned that there's a sort of a lack of transparency in a lot of the loans that are coming from China. And one criticism of that was that, or potential criticism was that foreign loans aren't necessarily more transparent, and potentially are we holding China to a standard that we're not holding other grant making or loan making organizations to?
Yeah, and actually one of the African countries owe more money to private entities than to China. So we focus on China, but really we should focus on private lenders. And it's true. I mean, there is a general lack of transparency. And I think China is particularly scrutinized now because it's a global rise, the competition with the US, but we should scrutinize many other entities.
The next question comes from a P. Hendricks, who asks, do you see there being political will in China for top-down imposition of stringent CSR policies, and there being possibly legal implications for not adhering to them in the future at some point?
Yeah, I think that's possible. And actually now they're already trying to blacklist companies that do bad deals abroad. And also there's, for instance, there is this new greening BRI report that puts certain projects in a red category, so you cannot even get funding for certain kind of projects. And I can see China recognizing those kind of limitations of its guidelines and becoming more more top down potentially. But again, it takes time, and it's not that linear. Once again, even if China tries to enforce, it's the way its control over these economic actors is not that straightforward. And this is something I want to emphasize. Maybe in the future, but like for now, I think we're still far from that.
And the last question, or at least the last ones we have right now, is from Kenton Kilmer, who asks, you mentioned 500,000 and 20,000, I'm sorry, 50,000 and 20,000 workers trained for the Kenyan and Ethiopian projects respectively. While this number sounds like a good quantitatively, does this not translate to a high attrition in workers in each project? Does that undermine the working conditions and social impact of those projects, especially as the Kenyan railroad was much shorter than the Ethiopian one? How many workers were actually on site at any one time during these projects?
Yeah, thank you. And so I don't know how many workers were on the site at any one time, but I think that there were issues, and I mentioned that for labor law disputes and poor treatment of workers. I haven't spoken with workers directly, so I didn't do that kind of work. But there's Miriam Dresden, for instance, at Oxford University, that did a great job. She's an anthropologist. She did field work, and she lived with Chinese and Ethiopian workers. And she talks about their lives, their hopes, but that's not like the kind of work I've done. I've done more high level kind of people, officials, and they told me that there were problems with labor lawsuit, that workers complain about the poor treatment that they received, and working too much for too little money, and so there were definitely issues. But yeah, I cannot reply. Let me see I don't know the last part of the question.
The last part was.
Yeah, no, I mean I cannot answer. How many are actually on site at any one time? That I cannot answer.
Gotcha. Okay. So we have another question from Noah Simon. Do you see potential domestic challenges facing China as it continues with the BRI? How will different coalitions react, and how will domestic politics change as the BRI continues? Yeah. So I think Minye would be the good person to answer this question. I don't know whether she's still around. And I think that like there's I think some of the people that I talked to, like, or there is a big concern that like why China is going out, giving all this money to projects abroad and not solving issues domestically. So I think that might be one of the issues, but I don't know. Domestic challenges facing, and I mean, just I think that with the BRI, really the biggest challenge I think is more external rather than domestic. Also because domestically they can manipulate the discourse of the BRI, successes and failure of BRI. So I see that the main issue will be probably abroad. I'm not that concerned with the domestic challenges. That makes sense. Yeah. Any last? Oh, I think a question just came in, right, Rose? Follow-up question by Kenton Kilmer. I understand CRCC is a much larger organization than CRBC. Do you have any anecdotal evidence on how these companies differed operationally? Yeah, actually, it very often, like when I was also in Ethiopia, they work together. They are in the same compound, bank, different Chinese constructor. So they're all the same people pretty much. I went even to eat with one of them, and like they gather all together. So they know each other, they operate. It would be interesting to understand better what are the, like how they exactly like they work, but I should have spent more time there. But to me, it was just so fascinating to see how they are in the same complex, and they eat together very often. They know each other, and there is less difference than what we imagine. It's just a name difference, but in reality, sometimes they're the same people. Right. No, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have a question, Tom?
Yeah, I was just thinking about AIB, and the one thing that gives BRI a bad reputation, and it's a deserved bad reputation, is this lack of transparency in the loans. And even in the Kenyan case, you have a relatively democratic, law-abiding environment, and they have various rules, and the Chinese lender basically breaks it by not having the loan be transparent. Is there anything that the international community can do to try to make the loans more transparent? And it always seemed to me, as someone who studied Chinese foreign relations, that it's in China's interest to make them more transparent, because the lack of transparency leads to a lot of the accusations and strange stories about debt traps and about corruption and other things, some of which are probably true in some cases, but it becomes a kind of pattern argument. Oh, they must all be corrupt and horrible because they're non-transparent. And we know that in AIB, which is only about 5% of BRI lending, that it is transparent and it's multilateral and it's rules-based. Is there anything that the international community can do, in your opinion, to encourage China in a positive sense to make more of its loans transparent, even if they're bilateral, or maybe put more of the money through international lending organizations like the AIB, which is now in collaboration with the Asia Development Bank and with even the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development? And from a diplomatic point of view, this is something that most countries want. And is there any way to move China on this?
Yeah, and China is also part of the AIIB, so I mean, it's aware of it's harmful to itself. But I think maybe one of the problem is that very often with the financing you have to hire Chinese construction companies, so that's not very if you want in the best interest of the country necessarily. So probably there are still some elements of the country that are not that that Chinese are not that willing to open up, but later on, I guess it will be definitely in their own best interest to make this agreements public, and also co-finance. But they're already doing part of that. They're co-financing with other multilateral investment banks, and so that's something that they can definitely do. But I think one of the probably elements that hold them back is this aspect of, like, that is a Chinese package that makes it also more efficient. So Chinese money, Chinese constructor, they already have experience. They can also guarantee in terms of time of construction and of the project. So, but this might be the case in the future, like to have more transparency, especially with the push from international society and civil society, also in host countries, media, that why even keep it secret, right? What are you hiding? What are you afraid to yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think we did all the questions. Thank you for an excellent talk. Is there anything else, Daniel?
I guess the only other thing would be to thank everybody, thank the speaker, thank you, Adele, and to remind everyone that we have one more event for the semester on April 22nd, which is entitled "The Last Line of Defense: U.S.-Indonesian Defense Relations and Strategic Competition in the Indo-Pacific," and to once again thank our speaker and wish everyone a great night.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adele. Come back more often. You can come back in the audience if you want to speak again. Just let us know. And good luck at NYU Shanghai. I'm not sure I mentioned that she landed a job as assistant professor at NYU Shanghai, and you can see the sign behind her.
Yes. It's straight. I hope it's straight. You never know. I'm still not good with this technology. I hope it's like the right.
No, it was very clear. It was very clear, and I learned a lot. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great seeing you.
Have a great night, everyone.
Bye.